more than 4 months after she disappeared from her Tucson home. Volunteers in Mexico say they received a tip about where her remains could be. 12 News reporter here with the latest. Maria?
Mark, that's right. This search group regularly looks for missing people, and they've helped find the remains of dozens of people in the Nogales area. But this is the first time they've received a tip that specifically mentioned Nancy Guthrie. For the Buscando Corazones, anonymous tips are common, often leading them to remote parts of Mexico as they search for missing people.
We usually get anonymous calls almost every day.
This time, they're looking for answers in a case that has captured national attention. Were you familiar with Nancy Guthrie when you did get that tip?
In reality, no, I didn't know. Once they told me, that's all I knew. Here in Mexico, we search for all those who are missing the same way.
Ramona Guadalupe Ayala Ortiz, the leader of the collective, says a caller last month told her Nancy Guthrie's remains are buried close to the Mariposa port of entry in Nogales, just across the border. Nancy, the mother of Today co-host Savannah Guthrie, has been missing since February after police say she was taken from her Tucson home. Savannah Guthrie has since returned to work, but the pain remains.
It's always with me, you know. I mean, I cry every morning on the way to work, and I cry every morning on the way home.
Despite video showing a masked man at Nancy's home the night she disappeared, there are still more suspects.
And we still need everybody's prayers, and we still wish someone would call and say what they know.
After receiving the tip on a possible grave site, volunteers alongside Mexican authorities conducted a search on May 16th and returned again on Wednesday.
They only told me to search near the streams, under a velvet tree. That's all. So we asked techniques for finding a clandestine grave.
Ramona says searchers are looking for any signs the ground may have been altered, including burn marks and uneven soil. But both searches have come up empty. Now they're planning to search another stream on Tuesday.
We have hope that we will.
The Pima County Sheriff's Office says they are aware of the reports about the anonymous tip. They say they have not been contacted by Mexican authorities about the search efforts and that their investigation is ongoing.
There is a question that has followed this case since the morning it broke open across every news channel in America. Not what happened. The what was confirmed within 72 hours, not when it happened. Investigators reconstructed the timeline with forensic precision. The question that has never been fully answered, the one that keeps people returning to this case years after the verdict, years after the sentencing, years after the cell door closed, is why. Why does a man who once genuinely loved his children wake up before dawn on a Monday morning and make a choice that cannot be undone? Why does a father who once held his daughters and read them bedtime stories and kissed them goodnight become the last person they ever saw? Chris Watts sat in interrogation rooms. He stood in front of news cameras. He gave confessions. He participated in prison interviews. He wrote letters. And across all of it, across every word he ever produced about that night in August 2018, he never delivered a complete, honest answer. But the answer exists. It has always existed. It assembled itself slowly, across 6 years, from court documents and forensic reports, and officially released law enforcement materials and his own words and letters he never expected the world to read. By the time this is over, you will understand this case in a way that most coverage has never allowed. And if you are new to this channel, welcome to Case Hunt TV. Hit that subscribe button now because this is exactly the kind of deep, documented storytelling we bring you every single week. To understand what happened in Frederick, Colorado in August of 2018, you have to go back further than the affair, further than the debt, further than any single event the media fixed on when this case first broke. You have to go back to the life that existed before the 13th of August, the one that was visible to the world, and the one that was happening behind closed doors simultaneously, in the same house, under the same roof, at the same dinner table where nobody said what needed to be said. Shannon Rizuchek was born in Aberdeen, North Carolina in 1984. She was warm, relentless, funny, and magnetic in a way that came through clearly whether you were sitting across from her or watching her through a phone screen. She had survived a diagnosis of lupus, an autoimmune disease that required significant medical management and left real physical consequences in her daily life. She had moved through financial hardship before. She knew what it felt like to rebuild, and she approached rebuilding the way she approached most things, with total commitment and visible energy. When she and Chris relocated to Colorado following his employment with Anadarko Petroleum, she built a business selling Thrive wellness supplements through the MLM company Livell and she built it the way people built businesses in 2015 and 2016, through Facebook Lives and personal testimony, and the kind of persistent social media presence that turned strangers into followers and followers into customers. Her videos were genuine. That point matters. Shanann was not manufacturing a personality for the camera. The warmth was real. The love for her daughters was real. The enthusiasm was real. She documented family dinners and doctor's appointments and the girls counting in Spanish, and Bella telling the camera she wanted a mermaid birthday party, and CEC refusing to say goodbye at the end of each video because she wasn't finished yet. She was building something, and she was proud of it, and she had every reason to be. Chris Watts appeared in those videos too, standing in the kitchen, holding CC during a supplement taste test, smiling when Shanann mentioned his name, nodding at the right moments. He looked, to anyone watching, like exactly what he was supposed to be. A devoted husband, a proud father, a man who had made good choices and was living comfortably inside them. The camera, however, is an instrument of selection. It captures what is pointed at it. It cannot capture the mortgage notices sitting on the counter just outside the frame. It cannot capture the silence that settled over the house after the camera was put down. It cannot capture the accumulating weight of a man who had spent years performing contentment he no longer felt. In 2015, 2 years after purchasing their 5-bedroom home in Frederick, Chris and Shanann Watts filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Court documents filed at that time listed nearly $70,000 in unsecured debt, including credit cards, medical bills, and personal loans. The bankruptcy was discharged, and they continued forward. But the underlying financial habits, the gap between the life they were projecting and the life they could actually afford, did not change in the years that followed. By the summer of 2018, they were falling behind on their mortgage again. Lavelle's compensation structure, like most MLM models, was dependent on recruitment volume and active sales, which meant Shanann's income was real but inconsistent. Chris's salary at Anadarko was steady, but it was not enough to cover what they owed while also covering what they spent. Final payment notices were arriving with regularity. Medical expenses sat unpaid. Credit accounts were at their limits. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. None of this was visible on the Facebook page. None of it was mentioned in the videos. And Chris Watts never mentioned it to anyone, not to Shanann in any direct or productive way, not to his parents in North Carolina, not to a financial advisor, not to a counselor. He operated his oil equipment in silence for long hours in the field. He came home. He mowed the lawn. He showed up. And inside himself, in the place where a psychologically healthy person might have said, "I need help. I am struggling. Something has to change." He said nothing. He accumulated. Christopher Lee Watts grew up in Pinehurst, North Carolina, in a working-class household. People who knew him as a child and as a young adult described him in terms that were nearly identical across interviews and accounts. Quiet, agreeable, eager to please, conflict, avoidant to a degree that was notable even then. He was not described as cold. He was not described as aggressive. He was described as someone who defaulted to agreement, who smoothed things over rather than confronting them, who presented no resistance because resistance felt dangerous in some deep and formative way he never examined out loud. He met Shanann in 2010 while working in North Carolina. They married in 2012. They moved to Colorado. They had Bella in 2013 and CEC in 2015. And by most visible measures, the family grew and the life expanded, and Chris Watts kept pace with it by stepping back and letting it unfold around him. The dynamic of their marriage was not abusive. It was not characterized by hostility or cruelty on either side. What it was, documented through the accounts of friends, family, and Shanann's own communications in the months before her death, was significantly imbalanced in a specific direction. Shanann led. Shanann decided she chose the house, built the business, set the pace, created the content, and drove the visible narrative of their shared life with the same relentless energy she brought to everything. Chris followed. He agreed. He went along, not because he was forced to, but because going along was the only mode he had ever consistently operated in. Forensic psychologists and behavioral analysts who examined this case after the fact identified his profile with clarity. Chronic people, pleasing and clinical conflict avoidance, sustained over years in a high-pressure environment with no emotional outlet, do not simply create unhappiness. They create accumulation, the unexpressed need, the unvoiced frustration, the swallowed truth. These things do not dissolve. They compound, and a man who has spent years building pressure with no release. Mechanism becomes, eventually, genuinely dangerous in ways that nothing in his visible history would suggest. This is the foundational truth of the Watts case that most coverage skips directly past. The murders did not begin on August 13, 2018. They began in every moment Chris Watts chose silence over honesty, performance over reality, and avoidance over the difficult and necessary work of being an honest participant in his own life. In the spring of 2018, Chris Watts began an affair with a coworker at Anadarko Petroleum named Nicole Kessinger. Investigators confirmed after the fact that Kessinger had no knowledge of the full reality of Chris's circumstances. He had told her he was in the process of separating from his wife. He said nothing about the pregnancy. He presented himself to her as a man whose marriage was effectively over and whose life was in the process of becoming something new. Kessinger cooperated completely and without reservation once she understood what had actually happened. She, too, had been deceived by Chris Watts, and investigators made that finding clear in their public statements. What the affair represented psychologically is the piece of this story that changes how everything else reads. Chris Watts was not simply seeking physical companionship outside his marriage. He was constructing a second identity, a version of himself that existed without the debt, without the failing mortgage, without the pregnancy he hadn't fully processed, without the cameras and the public performance and the daily evidence of his own inadequacy as a provider. With Nicole Kessinger, he was not a background figure in someone else's story. He was simply a quiet man in a work shirt, calm and available and unburdened. He felt, perhaps for the first time in years, like a person rather than a function. Forensic psychiatrists who study family annihilation cases consistently identify a psychological threshold they call fantasy displacement, the point at which an imagined future life becomes more real and more vivid to a person than the actual life they are living. It is not daydreaming. It is a dissociative shift in which the real life stops feeling like something to be engaged with and starts feeling like something to be escaped from. The people in that real life stop feeling like people the man loves and start feeling, in his distorted internal logic, like the reason he cannot have what he believes he deserves. By July and August of 2018, Nicole Kessinger was pressing for movement. She wanted to know whether he had filed for divorce, why Shanann was still calling, when the actual separation was going to happen. And Chris had no answers, because in the real world, nothing had moved. Shanann did not know. The house was still underwater. The baby was still coming. The two lives Chris had been running in parallel were approaching a collision he had made no effort to prevent. Shanann Watts returned from a business trip to Arizona in the early hours of August 13, 2018. Arriving home around 2 a.m, she was exhausted. She was 15 weeks pregnant. And she had spent the preceding weeks confiding to close friends that something felt profoundly wrong. That Chris had become cold, emotionally unreachable, a different person from the man she had built a life with. She was right. She did not know why she was right, and Chris had given her nothing to work with. What happened inside that house in the hours that followed is documented through forensic evidence, Chris Watts' own statements across multiple interviews and letters, and the physical findings of the medical examiner. Shanann Watts was manually strangled. The medical examiner's report was unambiguous. Bella and C, asleep in their rooms, were smothered. In letters Chris later wrote to a private pen pal, letters that were subsequently released publicly and reported on widely, he disclosed that he had been planning the murders for several weeks prior to that morning. He also disclosed in those letters that Bella woke up, that she saw him with her mother's body, that she asked him what was wrong with Mommy. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. Her autopsy findings, confirmed and reported by investigators, indicated she had fought back. Her father's DNA was recovered from underneath her fingernails. There is nothing that can be added to that fact that would make it more devastating than it already is. Following the murders, Chris Watts loaded the bodies of his wife and daughters into his work truck. He drove to the Cervi 319 oil field site, a remote Anadarko location where he was one of a small number of employees with authorized access. He placed Shanann's body in a shallow grave near a storage tank on the property. He placed Bella and CC inside separate crude oil storage tanks through access hatches that measured approximately 8 inches in diameter. He then drove to work. He responded to text messages. He behaved throughout the day in a manner that his coworkers later described as unremarkable. He went home. He interacted with a neighbor. He gave every external indication of a man living through a perfectly ordinary Monday. That evening, Shanann's colleague and close friend Nicole Atkinson, who had traveled with Shanann from Arizona and had been unable to reach her throughout the day, went to the house. Shanann's car was in the driveway. Her phone was inside. Her medication was inside. Her identification was inside. She would not have left without any of those things, and everyone who knew her understood that immediately. Nicole Atkinson called police. When officers arrived, Chris Watts was present. He cooperated. He expressed concern. He answered questions with the practiced steadiness of a man who had spent his entire adult life managing how he appeared to other people, now applying that same management to the worst circumstances imaginable. The following morning, the 14th of August, Chris Watts gave a television interview to a Denver news station, standing on the front lawn of the home where his family had been murdered less than 36 hours earlier. He told the reporter that the house had felt unbearable the night before without his children in it. He said his kids were his life. He said their smiles lit up his world. His voice broke at the moments where breaking seemed appropriate. His eyes filled at the moments where filling seemed appropriate. Forensic investigators were already processing evidence inside the house behind him. This is the characteristic that behavioral analysts and FBI profilers point to when they distinguish the family annihilator from other categories of violent offender. Not explosive rage. Not a dramatic unraveling. The terrifying ones are the ones who maintain composure, the ones who give interviews, the ones who perform grief with the same competency they performed every other role they ever inhabited. Chris Watts had spent years developing the ability to appear one way while feeling something entirely different. On the 14th of August, he deployed that ability in front of a news camera. Within 48 hours of that interview, investigators brought Chris Watts in for a formal recorded interview at the Weld County Sheriff's Office. They presented surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera that captured his truck leaving the residence in the early morning hours of the 13th of August. Under that pressure, he offered his first confession, but not an honest one. He claimed he had discovered Shanann strangling Sessa, that he had strangled Shanann in response, and that he had killed Bella afterward in a state of shock. This account contradicted the forensic evidence, the established timeline, and basic physical reality. Investigators knew it within hours. On August 15, 2018, 3 days after the murders, the bodies of Shanann, Bella, and CECE Watts were recovered from the Survey 319 oil field site. Shanann was located in a shallow grave. The girls were recovered from inside the crude oil storage tanks. Chris Watts was charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Shanann, Bella, and CECE. He was additionally charged with second-degree murder in the death of Nico Watts, the unborn child. He faced charges of unlawful termination of a pregnancy and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, he entered a guilty plea in November 2018. The agreement exchanged his cooperation and plea for 5 consecutive life sentences without any possibility of parole. On November 19, 2018, Judge Marcelo Kopkow sentenced Chris Watts at the Weld County Courthouse. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rizucek, delivered victim impact statements that were among the most painful public moments this case produced. Judge Kopkow, who had presided over thousands of criminal matters across 17 years on the bench, stated explicitly for the record that the Watts case was the most inhumane and vicious crime he had personally handled. He imposed the maximum sentence, 5 consecutive life terms. Chris Watts will die in prison. He sat through sentencing with the same flat composure he had maintained throughout every public appearance since the morning he drove to work after leaving his family's bodies at a remote oil field. He read a brief statement. He used the language of remorse. Observers and analysts noted that the language and the affect did not match. What happened after sentencing is the part of this case that most coverage stops short of covering in full. Chris Watts did not go silent. He continued to talk in multiple formats across multiple years, and each time he talked, the picture shifted slightly, not toward full clarity, but toward the revelation of new details alongside new questions about what he was still withholding. In December 2018, investigators conducted a 5-hour follow-up interview with him at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupunn, Wisconsin, where he was transferred following sentencing. That interview was later released publicly. In it, he retracted his earlier false claim that Shanann had harmed Sessa. He admitted to killing all 3 family members. He provided additional details about the sequence of events. But when investigators pressed him on the why, the motive, the emotional state, the decision-making, his answers remained vague, circular, and professionally unsatisfying to the investigators in the room. In 2019, he participated in what became publicly known as the Sermon on the Mount interview, a recorded conversation with 2 members of a religious ministry he had connected with in prison. The interview was released and became widely circulated and analyzed. In it, he described a spiritual darkness, claimed he was a different person than the one who committed the crimes, and spoke at length using the vocabulary of religious redemption. Forensic analysts and behavioral psychologists who reviewed the interview publicly noted a consistent concern. The emotional affect was flat throughout. The language was rehearsed. He described the deaths of his children with the same measured calm he used to describe everything else. The words described remorse. The delivery did not reflect it. Then, in 2021, letters he had written to a private pen pal were released and reported on across major outlets. Those letters changed the public understanding of the case in concrete ways. In them, Chris Watts disclosed that the murders had been planned for several weeks before the 13th of August. He disclosed the details of what happened when Bella woke up. He wrote, in private correspondence to a stranger he had never met, the most damaging and devastating details of that night. Details he had withheld from investigators, from the court, and from the victims' families who had been seeking a complete account since the day the bodies were found. The decision to disclose those details to a pen pal, rather than any appropriate official or family channel, is itself a data point. It is consistent with the same sideways, conflict-avoidant relationship with truth that characterized every significant moment of his adult life. The truth came out, but only at an angle, only in a direction that felt safe, only where direct honesty was not required. The why that this case has always demanded is not a mystery any longer, even if Chris Watts has never assembled it honestly in one place. It is documented across court, records, forensic findings, behavioral analysis, and his own words across 6 years of interviews, statements, and letters. It is this. He was drowning financially and had built an identity around never admitting weakness, never asking for help, and never allowing his failures to become visible. Divorce, in his distorted calculation, was not an escape from his circumstances. It was a public explosion of every failure he had spent years concealing. Child support for 3 children, legal costs he could not absorb, the loss of a house already heading toward foreclosure, the public record of a failed marriage stacked on top of a public record of a failed bankruptcy. His mind could not locate a version of divorce that didn't feel like destruction. He had spent so many years shrinking inside his own life, agreeing when he meant to object, going along when he needed to push back, performing happiness, while accumulating resentment, that by the summer of 2018, he no longer had any functional sense of who he was apart from the roles that were suffocating him. The affair was not simply an affair. It was the only place where he felt like a person with a future rather than a man trapped in a past he couldn't afford and a present he couldn't sustain. And the fantasy of that alternate life, the clean slate, the fresh start, the version of himself free of debt and obligation and the daily evidence of his own inadequacy, had become, in the clinical sense that forensic psychiatrists describe in family annihilation cases, more real to him than the actual lives of his children. His daughters, in his fractured internal world, were no longer separate from the problem. They were the problem. They were the reason he could not start over. They were the reason the fantasy could not become real. He did not kill them in a moment of passion. He planned it. He carried it out quietly, in the dark, while they slept. And then he went to work. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She had survived lupus. She had rebuilt her finances after genuine hardship. She had built a platform and a business from nothing. And she had loved her daughters with a fierce and documented and completely genuine joy. She deserved a husband who, when the walls closed in, chose honesty instead of silence. She deserved to be here. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old. She wanted a mermaid crown for her birthday. She recited a poem for her mother's camera about how her daddy was her hero. She fought back with everything she had. She deserved every birthday she never got to have. Celeste Catherine Watts was 3 years old. She was theatrical and fearless and made everyone around her laugh. She refused to say goodbye at the end of her mother's videos because she wasn't ready to stop. She deserved decades more of refusing to say goodbye. Nico Watts never got to be born. He was 15 weeks into his existence when it ended. He deserved to exist. Chris Watts is currently serving 5 consecutive life sentences at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He will not be released. The life he destroyed his family to obtain, the clean slate, the fresh start, the fantasy of a man unburdened and new, he never lived. Not for a single day. He went from that house to a holding cell to a courtroom to a prison, carrying every burden he thought he was escaping and adding the full weight of what he had chosen on top of it. The cage he spent years feeling trapped inside was never the house. It was never the marriage. It was never the debt or the cameras or the children or the pressure. The cage was his own avoidance. His silence, his inability to face himself honestly, his choice at every turn to perform rather than engage and to suppress rather than speak. You cannot escape that cage by destroying the people around you. It goes where you go. It is still there, in Wisconsin, in a cell smaller than the one he told himself he was escaping from. And the most enduring truth of this entire case, the one that stays with you after the details fade, is that none of it had to happen. Not the murders, not the loss, not any of it. At any point across the months that built toward that August morning, Chris Watts could have chosen differently. He could have said he was struggling. He could have asked for help. He could have chosen honesty over image, courage over comfort, the lives of his daughters over the comfort of his own fantasy. At every single one of those moments, he chose wrong. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico Watts deserved a husband and father who, when the weight became unbearable, chose to speak. They deserve to be here. If this breakdown gave you a clearer and more complete understanding of a case that has been misread and oversimplified since the day it broke, share this video. Because somewhere right now, someone still believes this was simply a story about an affair. It was never that simple. And if you want to go deeper on cases like this one, the full psychology, the documented facts, the questions that never get answered in mainstream coverage, subscribe to Case Hunt TV, because this is what we do. Hit the like button if this was worth your time. We will be back with another case. Until then,